Welcome back. We're on the, I don't want to say the downhill slide, or let's maybe say we're in the home stretch on chapter 3. And this is the part where students, I don't want to say have more difficulty, but sometimes with students, it gets a little confusing. And even myself, after years of going through this, sometimes I have to stop and think through the process, because now what we're talking about changes in supply and demand, and whether what happens to the equilibrium prices. So kind of start through talking about, what happens when demand shift and supply stays the same and vice versa. So, that intersection where, you're talking about downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, where they intersect is what's considered the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, both demanded and supplied. And that's the price and quantity that clears the market. And it, the simplistic model that we've developed, that's talking about just prices and quantities and holding everything else unchanged, it is a very valuable tool to the economist in trying just to explain the interaction between prices and quantity in any given market. And as I said, the equilibrium price and quantity is that price that clears the market. If you've got a shortage, it helps clear the market. If you've got a surplus, it helps clear the market. And basically what it means is, when it clears the markets, is buyers are willing and able to pay for it, and suppliers are willing and able to offer it. It's that, I don't want to say magic, but it's that price and quantity that clears the market and gets rid of both surpluses and shortages. And it talk about markets automatically gravitate to the equilibrium price and quantity, and tends to stay there, especially on price. It likes, the market kind of gets to that price and likes to stay there. And you can actually go back, and I think we talked about it earlier. Adam Smith, his Wealth of Nations, talked about the invisible hand that's setting out there, and that kind of invisible hand, kind of relates to the magic of the market, that, these multitude of forces, complex forces, are driving a given market, whether it's the market for healthcare, whether it's the market for agricultural commodities, the market for coffee, the market for stocks and bonds. Market forces are going to drive it to an equilibrium point. And that's what they talk about being the magic of the market. It's driving at that equilibrium point and that equilibrium pricing. And that's at equilibrium, it's where the market would like to stay. It doesn't always stay there, and we'll see that in a few minutes, but that's where the market would like to stay. And if it stays there, it's in the best interest of society. It implies self-interest in both buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers are both trying to optimize utility. Buyers' satisfaction, benefits, sellers' utility is their profit margins. So it's in the self-interest of both buyers and sellers to interact there at that equilibrium price. And it gives you freedom of production, freedom of consumption, especially in a free market. So when we talk about a free market, we mentioned it earlier, there's, no laws, no regulations, nothing that's going to inhibit the forces that are going to drive this market to equilibrium. And when we, talk about surplus, surplus is any time that we're above the supply-demand equilibrium level. And it basically means that, a surplus, you're above that equilibrium point where the two curves intersect. And it means that supply is greater than demand. And the market will eventually put downward pressure on that price to a certain extent that it's going to increase demand, get rid of that surplus, and get back to that equilibrium price. The same thing, remember, on a shortage, you're down below that intersection of the supply and demand curves. It's in a situation of a shortage, and that's where demand for a certain good or service increases. I mean, it's greater than your supply. It's going to put upward pressure on the price so that it increases the quantity supplied. So surplus above the equilibrium point, it puts price pressure, downward price pressure, and it causes the quantities demanded to increase. On a shortage, it's going to put upward pressure on the price to increase the quantity supply. So it gets it market back to the equilibrium. And that's what we're talking about, the magic of the market, the invisible hand, drives economists, drives any market, and the economy of that market, it drives it back to equilibrium. And if you think about, there were a lot of issues during COVID, mostly shortages, some surpluses, but again, mostly shortages during COVID. And one of the shortages that we really realized during COVID was access to healthcare goods and services. At the time, in spring of 2020, especially about April of 2020, the 1st of April, the state of New York, and I was in Buffalo still at the time, implemented that they were going to cease and desist with any elective surgeries. They didn't have enough hospital rooms, enough hospital beds to take care of the COVID issues. And so if you had an elective surgery, it just wasn't going to happen. They were still doing labor and delivery, still doing emergency work, but the majority of those services, resources, factors of production were all being allocated to taking care of the COVID population. And that was just on the hospital side. If you looked at the individual provider side or the physician side, they were having issues keeping staff in the office. They were closing offices. And if they were closing offices, they were significantly reducing the number of hours they were open. Sometimes providers were only there Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Some were there Tuesday, Thursday. And it actually sprung up kind of this little sub-economy or sub-market of telehealth medicine. Now, telehealth has been around a long time, but it hasn't been readily embraced in certain age, sexual demographics of the market, but it was forced to be accepted during COVID as an alternative because you just couldn't get in to see your doctor. So it worked well with emergencies. It worked well for illnesses. If you had annual visits scheduled, you just forgot about those. If you had a lot of radiology visits, lab work to do, you could still get your lab work done. You could still get your radiology work done, but it was more and more difficult. And we used a lab in Buffalo to get our lab work done, and you had to schedule an appointment. They brought you into the office one at a time. You would pull up, you would text them, you would sit in your car, and they would send you a text and said, come on in for your service. So it was a difficult time in healthcare. And so that's kind of the healthcare market when you're talking about shortages and surplus, but you can have the same thing in agricultural products. Let's say this year, farmers planted X number of acres in corn based on the historical yield per acre. And all of a sudden this year, it was either got a lot of rain and it was a great yield and, harvest and, yields were exceeded expectations, and you end up with, surpluses of corn that floods the market in the fall. And so again, the market's going to use the price mechanism to clear that surplus of corn. Same thing if it was a drought season and, corn yields were down and shortage, it will use that pricing mechanism to get rid of that shortage. You even see it with physician services in rural areas, or physician services maybe in Nashville. So use that pricing mechanism if you've got a shortage in an area like Nashville, but let's say you've got a surplus of physicians in St. Louis. You use that pricing mechanism to entice physicians from St. Louis to move to Nashville to practice medicine, and it takes care of shortages, and it takes care of surpluses in the market. And lastly, you might even see this happening in with professors. You see, an area that it's a university. It has maybe it's in a rural area, a place nobody wants to live, a depressed area. Even professors don't want to move there. But through a pricing mechanism, it will help alleviate surpluses and shortages over time and drive that market economy back to equilibrium. And again, a couple of things about equilibrium. The magic of the market exerts market pressures, drives prices upward and downward to get to that market equilibrium. And as long as there's competition, which competition applies many buyers and sellers, the market's going to drive prices to equilibrium. If the price is above the equilibrium point, which is a surplus, and we've talked about it, it's going to drive that price down to reach equilibrium. If it's a shortage, it's below equilibrium, it's going to drive that price up. So price comes down, quantity demanded increases, helps bring the price down. If it's a shortage, we're going to end up with suppliers, more quantity supplies, going to drive the price upward to get back to equilibrium. And what we're really talking about, it's quantity supplied and demanded. And getting rid of this equilibrium, or the initial equilibrium as the market functions to get rid of that, it's adjusting quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And the authors talk about if any of the shifters changes, either demand shifters or supply shifters change, then there's a shift in supply and demand, and you get to a new equilibrium price and quantity. So quantity demanded, quantity supplied, prices in that initial equilibrium, that's what's used to put pressure on the market to drive the prices. If you have a shift, either a upward or a right shift in either right or left shift in demand, or a right or left shift in supply, you reach a new equilibrium price and quantity, and then at that point the market takes effect again. They talk in the text about an increase in demand, and again, increase in demand, it's shifting that demand curve outward. It's going to increase price, it's going to increase quantity. Initially, it's going to be a shortage because suppliers weren't expecting it. It takes them a little while to catch up, but as the quantity supplied increases, again, puts pressure, raises price, clears the market. And again, they throw in there about the magic of the market and the adjustment process. In that particular instance, it was the consumers that happened to be driving the market. The buyers in the marketplace, they said, hey, we want more of that price. We want more of that commodity. We want more of that good and service supplied. And it took the suppliers a few minutes to catch up. And that's why they talk about consumer as king. The consumer is the driver. And it's called consumer sovereignty. That's where consumers actually control the output in the market system. And you see that a lot across a multitude of markets. It's the consumers that are driving the supplier decisions. If there's a decrease in demand, so demand has gone to the right to increase. If it goes to the left to decrease, price and quantity both decrease. And it takes, there's an initial surplus, and it takes the market to put downward pressure on price to get rid of that surplus. Now, if we're thinking about supply, if there's an increase in supply, so it slides down to the right, there's a reduction in price, there's an increase in commodity, there's an increase in quantity, and you end up with a surplus. And again, downward pressure on that price to get everything back into equilibrium. And then finally, when we talk about the supply curve shifting, if it shifts to the left and it's a shift to the left, it's a decrease in supply, then it's going to increase price, but it's at the same time going to decrease the quantity, and you end up with a shortage. And upward pressure on prices gets everything back to that equilibrium. So again, it's the magic of the market. It's either upward or downward pressure on price that helps clear the market, helps allocate or helps adjust the market so that buyers and sellers are functioning at a price that helps clear that market. And then they talk about, make a couple of comments. They say demand for a good reflects desire or willingness. And that is true, because we talk about in multiple occasions that two things have to be in place for demand to be there. There has to be a willing or a desire to go after that commodity or to secure that good or service, and there has to be a willingness to pay it. And the supply of a good, they talk about scarcity. And again, we talked about the scarcity and supply, because the scarcity and supply is somewhat driven by the scarcity in the resources or the factors of production that go into generating that supply. And so as we pull all of these factors together, as we're helping you build that toolbox and add different tools into your toolbox, we hope that at some point, once you get into the market, once you get into full employment or graduate and take a new position, that is changes in this supply and demand will help you to navigate those issues that you're going to incur when you get out and get, maybe it's not your first job, but when you go out and get your next job. We hope that this toolbox that we're helping you build will help you be more successful in that job. I'm going to wind this particular segment up with a piece of, I don't want to say a piece of the puzzle, but it's the piece of the whole supply demand model that tends to confuse the majority of the students. I had a professor when I was at Ohio State that was my mentor, and he said, when you're teaching econ classes and you're talking about supply and demand, he says, some students do really well drawing it out on paper. They put the price on the y-axis, they put the quantity on the x-axis, downward slope in demand, upward slope in supply, and start shifting each of those and looking at the impact. And he said, and then you have other students that like to sit in class, or he said, I've seen them actually sit on test, and rather than drawing it out, he says they will shut their eyes and kind of in their mind's eye, they're going through, okay, here's my downward sloping demand, here's my supply. What happens when supply increases? And he says you can see them kind of working through what happens on prices and quantity as supply increases. Or he says, here's supply and demand decreases. He says you can actually see them. And he says, then they'll open their eyes and they'll start writing on the test. So he said, it works well depending on the students, but he says, I've seen them do it both ways, and whatever works best for them is the way you teach it. And I've always, I guess, taught it both ways and have afforded the students the options of, either in your mind's eye, sitting there and seeing how that changes, or drawing it out on paper, whichever works best for you. But we're going to talk just a few minutes about what happens with simultaneous shifts. Demand curve shifting at the same time, supply curves, and it happens every day. It happens every day in this very complex world we live in. You see the impacts of it in the stock market. You see the impacts of it in the prices you're paying at the grocery store. You see the impacts on, the technology you have at home, what your TV bundle looks like, is it Comcast? Is it, DirecTV? You see it in your everyday life, and it gets really complex. And even you see the talking heads on TV, you can see that they sometimes struggle with it, and you'll see them stop, and you'll even see me on these videos stop, and I'm thinking through it, and I'm thinking to myself, now, is that right? Am I actually providing accurate information? But what typically happens, and the book does a pretty good job, and I don't remember what page it's on, but they've got a little 2x2 table set up, and they've got at the top, I think it says supply increase, supply decrease, maybe demand decrease. And I can't remember exactly how the table is set up, but again, it's like a little 2x2. And in each of the little cells under each one of the headings, it talks about what happens to price and what happens to quantity. And so if you think about it, so you've got demand down, you've got supply up. If they both shift to the left, so demand comes down, supply goes up. If they both shift to the left, you automatically know that quantity is going to decrease. What you don't really know is what's going to happen to price, because it depends on which curve shifts the greater magnitude is going to what drives what really happens to price. Price could change a lot. Price might not change much, but if they both shift to the left, you know the quantity is going to decrease because the total demand for that good or service is decreased, and the total supply for that good or service is decreased. And so you end up with a reduction in quantity, but you really don't know what the absolute change in price is going to be. If they both shift, and again, you've got them sitting here, if they both shift to the right, so increased demand, increased supply, you automatically know that there's going to be a increase in quantity, but you, again, don't know what's going to happen to price. So if they both move in the same direction, whether it's both of them move to the left or both of them move to the right, if they both move to the left, you know the quantity is going to decrease. If they both move to the right, you know quantity is going to increase, but you don't really know what's going to happen to price because it's the magnitude of that change that's going to drive what really happens to the equilibrium price. Now, if demand increases to the right, so demand is stronger. If supply decreases to the left, you know that price is going to automatically increase, but you don't know what's going to happen to the quantity. And that goes back to the magnitude, which one of these curves increased or decreased the most, because that's going to help alleviate the conundrum of what's really happened to quantity. And then finally, if demand goes to the left and shrinks, supply goes to the right with an increase, you know that price is going to go down. There's not a demand for the product as much as there was. There's there's more supply than there need to be. So price, is going to go down. But again, you don't know what's going to happen to the quantity. It's ambiguous at that point without knowing the true magnitudes of those shifts. So, and it's the results of this 2x2 that helps, I guess, form policymakers. It's what helps form expectations in the market. It's what helps consumers and suppliers both drive the decisions that they make on a daily basis, whether it's purchasing decisions or whether it's supplying decisions. So my suggestion is to spend a few minutes on that 2x2 graph. And if you have questions about it, reach out to me and I'll try to answer them for you. That's going to wind up chapter 3. We've talked about supply and demand, and I think in chapter 4, we're going to get into how to take supply and demand and then apply them to some real world instances. I'm not sure that all the examples they include in the book are real world, but they make for good reading, and it's an interesting discussion topic, and it does help show that how you can use this supply and demand model to answer a lot of the questions in a really complex economic environment. Hope to see you when we start on chapter 4. Otherwise, thanks for joining today, and have a good rest of the day.